So on the other side of the career discussion, we have people like Thomas Friedman, who has never really faced any consequences for his journalism, despite being a cheerleader for Iraq. Not only was he a cheerleader for Iraq kind of initially, but he was even asked about his views on Iraq by Charlie Rose. So here he is during an interview with Charlie Rose. And of course, Thomas Friedman is a New York Times op-ed columnist. So let's hear what he had to say.
Now that the war is over and there's some difficulty with the peace, was it worth doing?
Well, I think it was unquestionably worth doing, Charlie. And I think that looking back, I now certainly feel I understand more what the war was about. And it's interesting to talk about it here in Silicon Valley, because I think looking back at the 1990s, I can identify that there were actually three bubbles of the 1990s. There was the NASDAQ bubble. There was the corporate governance bubble. And lastly, there was what I would call the terrorism bubble. And the first two were based on creative accounting. The last was based on moral creative accounting. The terrorism bubble that basically built up over the 1990s said, flying airplanes into the World Trade Center, that's okay. Wrapping yourself with dynamite and blowing up Israelis in a pizza parlor, that's okay. Because we're weak and they're strong and the weak have a different morality. Having your preachers say that's okay, that's okay. Having your charities raise money for people who do these kinds of things, that's okay. And having your press call people who do these kind of things martyrs, that's okay. And that built up as a bubble, Charlie. And 9/11 to me was the peak of that bubble. And what we learned on 9/11 in a gut way was that that bubble was a fundamental threat to our open society. Because there is no wall high enough, no INS agent smart enough, no metal detector efficient enough to protect an open society from people motivated by that bubble. And what we needed to do was go over to that part of the world, I'm afraid, and burst that bubble. We needed to go over there, basically, and take out a very big stick, right in the heart of that world, and burst that bubble. And there was only one way to do it, because part of that bubble said, we've got you. This bubble is actually going to level the balance of power between us and you, because we don't care about life. We're ready to sacrifice, and all you care about are your stock options and your Hummers. And what they needed to see was American boys and girls going house to house from Basra to Baghdad, and basically saying, which part of this sentence don't you understand? You don't think, we care about our open society? You think this bubble fantasy, we're just going to let it grow? Well, suck on this, okay? That, Charlie, was what this war was about. We could have hit Saudi Arabia. It was part of that bubble. Could have hit Pakistan. We hit Iraq because we could. That's the real truth.
And the mess.
So, that's what he said on television. Not behind closed doors, not on a hot mic.
That's what he said a bit more bluntly than what usually has filtered through his Pulitzer Prize-winning commentaries for 30 years at least. It's really symptomatic that Thomas Friedman is extremely popular on so-called public broadcasting, on NPR, on PBS. We should remember Charlie Rose, who eventually got Me Too'd, justifiably, so his career hit a wall. But Charlie Rose, also on 60 Minutes as a correspondent, Rose extremely popular, supposedly intelligentsia. He used to kiss the feet of Henry Kissinger and so forth in his interviews. That's standard. That's sort of the mentality. And so again, yes, Fox News is proto-fascist at this point, but the so-called liberal media, the PBSs, the NPRs, the New York Times, they were a source of promulgating this attitude, maybe not usually so bluntly. It's clear, and I have many examples in this book about Thomas Friedman, He's a sadist, but it's wrapped up in the American flag. So that's okay. Several years before that interview, during 1999, he wrote for the New York Times a series of columns that I quote in the book, where he called for more and more bombardment of civilian areas. He basically called for war crimes when the United States was leading the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia and Kosovo. He said that if the government of Yugoslavia wouldn't give up, that the US should keep bombing more and more intensely civilian infrastructure, which is a war crime. Get rid of the electricity and the water. What about people who need refrigerated medicine? What about people who are children or the elderly? Not a problem. He said, if the government did not succumb to the demands of US-led NATO warfare, then the United States could bomb them back to the 15th century. This is unbelievable, perhaps, except he wrote it and the New York Times published it. No problem, not a ripple of pushback from the so-called enlightened intellectual media outlets. Again, this is not Newsmax. This is people who were told are Democratic Party aligned, very forward-looking, humanistic folks. So after he was calling for essentially war crimes in 1999 over Yugoslavia, a few years later, he won the Pulitzer Prize for commentary. And I should add that when you look at some of the favorite radio programs nationally, for instance, Fresh Air, hosted by Terry Gross. Now, Terry Gross and that entire program, they love Thomas Friedman. They've had him on many, many times. And when you look at coverage of foreign policy in general, it's a regular parade of journalists from the New York Times and the Washington Post and the New Yorker, all of those outlets cheerleading the war on Afghanistan, the war on Iraq, and the current US policies towards Ukraine.